It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning, the kind of day that makes you want to be outside. I was in my front yard, having a good time stacking rocks into a little garden. They weren't big rocks or anything special, just smooth, round stones I'd picked up here and there over the years. I liked how they looked all piled up together, like a tiny mountain. It wasn't a fancy project or some huge deal. To me, it was just a fun way to spend the day. Most people in my neighborhood didn't mind it at all. Some even waved and smiled as they walked by with their dogs or kids. Nobody cared about my little rock pile. Well, almost nobody. Then there was Karen. Oh, Karen. She wasn't like the other neighbors. She didn't just live on our street, she acted like she owned it. Every day, she'd march around with her clipboard, looking for trouble. That clipboard was her weapon. If your grass was too tall, she'd write it down. If your trash can stayed out too long, she'd scribble a note. And if you dared to do something she didn't like, watch out. She'd slap a fine on you faster than you could blink. Karen was the boss of the neighborhood, or at least, she thought she was. Everyone knew her, and nobody liked her. That Saturday, Karen decided it was my turn to feel her wrath. I was kneeling in the dirt, stacking my rocks, when I heard her loud, stompy footsteps coming my way. I looked up, and there she was standing at the edge of my yard with her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed. She stared at my rock garden like it was the worst thing she'd ever seen. Her clipboard was tucked under her arm, ready for action. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped. Her voice was sharp, like a teacher scolding a kid for chewing gum in class. I brushed some dirt off my hands and stood up, wondering what her problem was this time. "This isn't allowed," she barked, pointing at my pile of rocks. She jabbed her finger at it over and over, like she was trying to poke holes in the air. "You can't just put junk like this in your yard. It's against the rules." I tilted my head and looked at her. "Rules? What rules? My rocks weren't hurting anybody. They were just sitting there, minding their own business." But Karen didn't care about that. To her, my little garden was a crime scene, and I was the bad guy. She puffed out her chest and glared at me, waiting for me to say something. I didn't argue. I didn't yell back. I just shrugged my shoulders and said, "Okay." That made her even madder. Her face turned pink, and her eyes got all squinted. She hated when people didn't fight with her, it took away her fun. "You think this is a joke?" she shouted. "I'm serious. This is an eyesore. It's a danger. I'm going to report you." I nodded a little, not really sure what to say. An eyesore? A danger? They were just rocks. How could rocks be dangerous? But Karen was on a mission, and nothing was going to stop her. What she didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that trouble was already coming. And it wasn't coming for me. Nope. It was headed straight for Karen, like a storm she couldn't see. While she stood there yelling at me, something big was brewing behind her back. It was sneaky and quiet, like a secret waiting to pop out and surprise everyone. I didn't know the whole story yet either, but I could feel it. Something wasn't right. And soon, Karen was going to find out just how wrong things could get. Let me paint the picture for you. My house is on a little street with neat rows of homes. There are green lawns, a few trees, and kids riding bikes sometimes. It's a normal place, quiet and friendly, except when Karen's around. My yard isn't huge, but it's mine. I've got a small porch, some flowers by the steps, and now, my rock garden. It's not much, but I like it. Karen's house is 2 doors down. Her yard is perfect, too perfect. The grass is always cut just right, and her bushes are trimmed into little squares. She spends all her time making sure everything looks like a picture in a magazine. Maybe that's why my messy pile of rocks made her so mad. I'd seen Karen boss people around before. Last month, she yelled at Mr. Jenkins because his dog barked too loud. The month before that, she told Mrs. Carter her mailbox was the wrong color. Nobody ever fought back, they just rolled their eyes and waited for her to leave. But this time, she picked me. And this time, things were going to be different. Not because I was going to fight her, but because something else was about to happen, something she never saw coming. While Karen kept shouting, I glanced around the street. Everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and a breeze rustled the leaves. But then I noticed something strange. Down the road, parked under a big tree, was a police car. It wasn't moving. Its lights were off, and it just sat there, quiet as a mouse. I squinted to get a better look. 2 officers were inside, watching us. Watching her. My stomach did a little flip. Why were they here? Did Karen call them already? No, that couldn't be it. She was still waving her arms and yelling at me. She hadn't even pulled out her phone yet. So what was going on? I didn't know, but I had a funny feeling. Karen thought she was in charge, standing there with her clipboard and her loud voice. She thought she could scare me into tearing down my rock garden. But she didn't see the cops. She didn't see the trap closing in around her. All her attention was on me and my silly pile of stones. She was so busy being mad that she missed the real trouble sneaking up behind her. I kept my mouth shut and let her rant. "You're going to regret this," she said, shaking her head. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what a rule breaker you are." I nodded again, acting calm. Inside, though, my mind was racing. Those cops weren't here for me, I could tell. They were too far away, too sneaky. Something bigger was happening, and Karen was about to step right into it. Karen wasn't done with me yet. Oh no, yelling wasn't enough for her. She had to take it up a notch. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and started dialing right there in my front yard. I watched her fingers jab at the screen like she was mad at it. She held the phone to her ear and waited, tapping her foot on the grass. Then she started talking, well, more like shouting. "Hello? Yes, I need help. This is an emergency," she screeched. Her voice was so loud, I bet the whole street could hear her. "There's an illegal structure here. It's ugly, it's dangerous, and someone needs to do something about it right now." I stood there with my arms crossed, looking at her. She was talking about my rock garden, my little pile of stones. Illegal. Ugly. Dangerous. I almost laughed out loud, but I held it in. My rocks weren't hurting anybody, they were just sitting there. But Karen acted like they were about to explode or something. She kept going, her words flying out fast. "Yes, it's in my neighbor's yard. He won't listen to me. You need to send someone quick." The person on the phone, the dispatcher, sounded tired. I could hear a bored through the speaker. But Karen didn't care. She was on a mission, and she wasn't going to stop. Her face was turning red, like a tomato. She waved her free hand around, pointing at my rocks again and again. "This is serious," she yelled into the phone. "It's a total eyesore. It's ruining the neighborhood." I shifted my feet and watched her. She looked so silly, getting all worked up over a few stones. I wanted to say something, like, "Karen, calm down, it's just rocks." But I didn't. I stayed quiet and let her keep going. She was too busy glaring at me to notice anything else. Her eyes were locked on me, like I was the worst person in the world. While she ranted, I started to notice something weird. Down the street, not too far away, there was a police car. It wasn't moving. It was just parked there, under a big shady tree. The lights on top were off, and it was super quiet. I squinted to see better. 2 officers were inside, sitting still. They weren't getting out or driving over. They were just waiting. For what? I didn't know yet, but it made my stomach feel funny, like when you're about to figure out a secret. Karen didn't see the cop car. Nope. She was way too busy yelling at me and the phone. "I'm telling you, this is against the rules," she said, her voice getting higher and louder. "He can't just do whatever he wants. We have standards here." She turned to me and shook her head, like I'd let her down. "You're in big trouble now," she said, smirking a little. She thought she'd won already. She thought the police were going to come racing over, sirens blaring, to tear down my rock garden and drag me away. But those cops down the street? They weren't moving. They didn't even look like they cared about my rocks. Something else was going on, something Karen didn't know about. I kept my mouth shut and watched her. Inside my head, I was starting to wonder. Why were the police already here? Did someone else call them? Was it about something bigger than my little garden? My eyes flicked back to the car, then to Karen. She was still talking, still waving her arms, still acting like the queen of the neighborhood. I leaned against my porch steps and let her keep going. "You're going to regret this," she told me, wagging her finger in my face. "When the police get here, they'll make you take it all down." I nodded a little, just to keep her happy. But I wasn't worried about my rocks. I was more curious about that police car. It was so strange. Why were they just sitting there? Why weren't they coming over? Karen thought she'd called the cops on me, but what if they were here for something else? What if they were here for her? The more she talked, the more I noticed little things. Karen's voice was loud, but it sounded shaky, too, like she was nervous about something. Her hands were twitchy, and she kept looking around, but never at that cop car. Maybe she didn't want to see it. Maybe she was hiding something. I'd heard whispers from other neighbors before, little bits about Karen being sneaky with the HOA money. Nobody had proof, but people talked. Was that why the cops were here? I didn't know yet, but the idea stuck in my brain like gum on a shoe. She finally hung up the phone and stuffed it back in her pocket. "There," she said, crossing her arms. "They're on their way. You're done for." She smiled like she'd just won a prize. I didn't say anything back. I just stood there, looking at her, then glancing at that quiet police car again. The officers inside were still watching. Watching us. Watching her. My heart started beating a little faster. Something big was coming. I could feel it. Karen didn't feel it, though. She was too proud of herself. She thought she'd scared me, thought she'd beat me with her phone call. "You should have listened to me," she said, shaking her head. "I gave you a chance to fix this, but no, you had to be stubborn." She turned and looked at my rock garden one more time, wrinkling her nose like it smelled bad. "Disgusting," she muttered. Then she stood there, waiting for the police to show up and back her up. But they were already here. They'd been here the whole time. And they weren't moving yet. That made me think they weren't waiting for her 911 call. They weren't here about my rocks. They were waiting for something else, something Karen didn't expect. I kept my face blank so she wouldn't guess what I was thinking. Inside, though, my mind was spinning. What was she hiding? What had she done? The tension was building, like a rubber band stretching tighter and tighter. The street was quiet now, except for Karen's huffing and puffing. The sun was still shining, and a bird chirped somewhere nearby. Everything seemed normal except it wasn't. That police car was like a shadow, sitting there, ready to change everything. Karen didn't see it. She didn't know. She kept staring at me, waiting for me to give up. But I wasn't the one in trouble. Not today. Something was about to happen, and I had a front row seat. Time kept moving, slow and steady. The minutes ticked by, 1, then 2, then 3. Karen didn't stop. She was like a wind-up toy that wouldn't run out of energy. She paced back and forth in my yard, her shoes stomping on the grass. She muttered to herself, saying stuff about rules and standards over and over. Her voice was low but grumpy, like a dog growling at nothing. She was still mad about my rock garden, my little pile of stones that didn't hurt anybody. She couldn't let it go. Then she stopped pacing and reached into her bag. She pulled out a little book, her HOA handbook. It was full of rules for the neighborhood, and she treated it like gold. She flipped the pages fast, her fingers moving like she was in a race. "Here it is," she said, her voice loud again. She held the book up high and pointed to a page. "See? Page 47, no unapproved yard decorations." She waved the book in front of my face, like it was a magic wand that would make my rocks disappear. "This proves it. You're breaking the rules." I nodded a little, just to keep her calm. I didn't really care about her book or her rules. My rocks weren't in that handbook, and I wasn't scared of her. But I didn't say that. I kept my mouth shut and let her talk. While she waved her book around, my eyes kept sneaking away. They went back to that police car down the street, the one parked under the tree. It was still there, quiet and sneaky. The officers inside hadn't moved yet. They were just sitting, watching. I wondered what they were waiting for. Then something new happened. Another police car rolled up. This one was super quiet, no sirens, no lights, just a soft hum as it stopped. It parked closer to Karen's house, not mine. 2 officers climbed out, slow and careful. They didn't walk over to me or my rocks. Nope. They went straight to Karen's yard instead. They stood near her front door, huddling together like they were sharing a secret. One of them peeked at her windows, tilting his head to look inside. The other one wrote something on a little pad. Weird, right? Why were they at her house? Karen didn't notice. Not even a little bit. She was too busy ranting at me. You think you're so smart, she said, shaking her head. But you're not. The police are coming, and they'll make you take this junk down. She pointed at my rock garden again, her finger jabbing the air. She was so caught up in being mad that she didn't see the cops at her house. She didn't hear the second car pull up. She was blind to it all, stuck in her own little world. I stayed quiet, but my brain was buzzing. I started connecting dots, like putting puzzle pieces together. Those cops weren't here for me, I could feel it. They were watching Karen, not my rocks. And the more I thought about it, the more things made sense. Karen had been acting strange lately, not just today, but for weeks. She'd been extra twitchy, like a cat that hears a loud noise. She snapped at everyone, even more than usual. If someone said hi, she'd bark something mean and storm off. And sometimes, she'd disappear, gone for hours with no explanation. Where did she go? What was she doing? I remembered little things, too. Last week, Mr. Jenkins said Karen yelled at him for no reason just because his dog barked once. 2 days ago, Mrs. Carter told me Karen banged on her door, complaining about a flower pot being too bright. Too bright? That didn't even make sense. And then there were the whispers, quiet talk from neighbors about Karen and the HOA money. People said she was sneaky with it, maybe even taking some for herself. Nobody had proof, but the idea stuck around like a bad smell. Was that why the cops were here? My eyes flicked back to the officers. They were still by Karen's house, moving slow and careful. One of them pulled out a phone and started talking, keeping his voice low. The other one looked at her windows again, like he was trying to see through the curtains. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but they didn't look happy. They didn't look like they were here for a friendly visit, either. Something was up, something big. Karen kept talking, oblivious to it all. I've been running this neighborhood for years, she said, puffing out her chest. I know what's best, and this mess is not it. She glared at my rocks like they'd insulted her. You're lucky I'm giving you a warning. When the police get here, they won't be so nice. She smirked, thinking she had all the power. She didn't know the cops were already here. She didn't know they were at her house, not mine. I shifted my feet and glanced at the first cop car again. The officers inside were still watching. Now there were 2 cars, 2 sets of police hanging around. That wasn't normal. If they were here for my rocks, they'd have come over by now, right? They'd have talked to me, told me to take it down. But they didn't. They were focused on Karen's place, not mine. My heart beat a little faster. What was she hiding? What had she done? I started thinking harder. Karen always acted like she was perfect, her yard, her rules, her everything. But maybe that was a cover. Maybe she was pretending to be the boss so nobody would look too close. The more I watched her, the more nervous she seemed. Her hands shook a tiny bit when she waved that handbook. Her voice cracked sometimes, like she was trying too hard. She was mad, sure, but maybe she was scared, too. Scared of something I didn't know yet. The officers by her house moved again. One of them walked to the side, peeking around the corner. The other one stayed by the door, looking back at the street. They were sneaky, like hunters waiting for the right moment. Karen didn't see any of it. She was still pacing in my yard, muttering about how I'd learn my lesson. She thought she was winning. She thought she was in control. But the truth was creeping closer, and she had no idea. Things were getting wild now. The sun was still shining, and the street was quiet until it wasn't. A third police car rolled up, and this one was different. Its lights were flashing red and blue, spinning fast. The sound of the engine growled as it stopped right in front of my house. Karen's eyes lit up when she saw it. She turned to me with a big, smug smirk on her face. "See," she said, her voice loud and proud. "I told you they'd handle this. The police are here now, and you're in big trouble." She crossed her arms and nodded, like she'd just won a prize. She thought the cops were here for me for my little rock garden. She thought she'd beat me. I didn't say anything. I just watched. The car doors opened, and two officers stepped out. They were tall and serious, with shiny badges on their uniforms. Karen kept smiling, waiting for them to march over and yell at me. She even pointed at my rocks again, like she was showing them the problem. "That's it right there," she said, all excited. "That's the illegal thing I called about." She was so sure of herself, so happy. She thought this was her big moment. But then something crazy happened. The officers didn't come to me. They didn't even look at my rock garden. Nope. They walked right past it, right past me, and headed straight for Karen. Their boots thumped on the ground as they got closer to her. Karen's smirk started to fade. Her eyes got wide, and she took a tiny step back. "Wait, what?" she mumbled, her voice shaking. The officers stopped in front of her, and one of them spoke. His voice was sharp, like a teacher calling out a kid who'd been bad. "Karen Mitchell?" he asked. Karen blinked fast. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. Then she stammered, yes. That's me." She sounded confused, like she didn't know what was happening. The officer didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He just reached down to his belt and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. They jingled in his hand, shiny and silver. "Karen Mitchell," he said again, loud and clear. "You're under arrest for fraud and theft. We've been watching you for weeks." My jaw dropped. I mean, it literally fell open. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Karen. Arrested. For fraud and theft? I stood there, frozen, staring at her. Her face went white like all the color drained out of it. "What?" she yelled, her voice cracking. "This is a mistake. You've got the wrong person." She waved her hands in the air, trying to back away, but the officers stepped closer. The second cop grabbed her arm, not hard, but firm, and held her still. Fraud and theft. I thought to myself. What did that even mean? Then it hit me like a light bulb turning on in my head. The HOA money. All those whispers from the neighbors were true. Karen had been stealing from the HOA dues, the money everyone paid to keep the neighborhood nice. Thousands of dollars, gone, right into her pocket. She'd been sneaky about it, pretending to be the perfect rule keeper while she took cash behind our backs. And the cops? They'd known all along. They'd been watching her, waiting for the right time to catch her. Karen's eyes darted around, like she was looking for a way out. "No, no, no," she shouted. "I didn't do anything. This is about him." She pointed at me, her finger shaking. "He's the one breaking rules. Arrest him, not me." But the officers didn't even glance my way. They weren't here for me or my rocks. They were here for her. The first cop shook his head. "We've got evidence, ma'am," he said. "Bank records, fake receipts, everything. You're coming with us." I couldn't stop staring. This was nuts. Karen had called 911 on me, thinking she'd get me in trouble. She'd stood there in my yard, yelling about my rock garden, acting like she was the boss. But the whole time, the police were already onto her. That first cop car I'd seen? The second one by her house? They weren't random. They were part of a plan to nab Karen. She'd walked right into her own trap without even knowing it. The officer with the handcuffs stepped forward. "Put your hands behind your back," he said. Karen shook her head fast. "No. You can't do this. I'm innocent," she cried. But it didn't matter. The cop didn't argue. He just took her wrists, gentle but strong, and clicked the handcuffs on. The sound was loud, click, click, and it echoed in the quiet street. Karen's shoulders slumped, and she stopped yelling. She looked smaller now, like all her big, bossy energy was gone. I rubbed my eyes, making sure I wasn't dreaming. This was real. Karen, the lady who'd been picking on everyone, waving her rule book, calling the cops on me, was the real bad guy. And she didn't even see it coming. I thought back to how she'd smirked when that third cop car showed up. She'd been so sure it was for me. She'd crowed, "I told you they'd handle this." Oh, they were handling it, all right, just not the way she wanted. The second officer pulled out a little radio and talked into it. "Suspect in custody," he said. I didn't know what custody meant exactly, but I could guess it meant Karen was caught. She wasn't going anywhere except with them. The first cop turned to me for the first time. You're fine, he said, nodding at my rocks. This isn't about you. Then he looked at Karen again. Let's go, he told her. Karen's head dropped. She didn't fight anymore. She just stared at the ground as they led her toward the flashing cop car. Her fancy shoes dragged on the pavement, and her clipboard fell out of her bag, landing in the grass. Nobody picked it up. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to wrap my head around it all. This was the twist of the day of the year. Karen thought she'd won, but she'd lost everything. And me? I was just a guy with a rock garden, watching it all go down. What a crazy, crazy moment. Karen didn't go quietly. As the cops put the handcuffs on her, she kept talking, fast and loud. This is a mistake, she yelled, her voice all shaky. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm the victim here. She twisted her head around, looking at the officers like they'd listen to her. But they didn't. The cops just shook their heads and held her arms tighter. They'd heard her story already, and they weren't buying it. They knew the truth. Karen was the one in trouble, not me. They started walking her to the police car with the flashing lights. Her feet dragged a little, like she didn't want to go. She kept shouting, "You've got the wrong person." But nobody believed her. Neighbors started peeking out their windows, pulling back curtains to see what was happening. I could hear whispers from across the street, little bits of what's going on, and is that Karen? People were shocked, just like me. I didn't move. I just leaned against my rock garden, my arms crossed, watching the whole show. It was wild. Later that day, we got the full story. It turns out Karen had been sneaky for months, way longer than anyone guessed. She'd been faking receipts, pretending she spent HOA money on stuff for the neighborhood. But really, she was keeping the cash for herself. Thousands of dollars. All that money we paid for things like fixing the playground or trimming trees. Gone, right into her pocket. The cops had proof, papers, bank stuff, everything. That's why they'd been watching her for weeks. They were waiting to catch her red-handed. That night, the HOA had an emergency meeting. Everyone crammed into Mrs. Carter's living room because it was the biggest house on the street. People were mad, really mad. They talked about how Karen bossed us around, making rules nobody liked, while she was stealing from us the whole time. Someone said, she acted like the queen, but she was a thief. Then Mr. Jenkins stood up and said, let's get rid of her dumb rules. Everyone cheered. They voted right there, no more Karen rules. And guess what? They decided my rock garden could stay. People even clapped for it. By the time the sun went down, Karen was gone. The police took her away, and nobody knew when she'd be back, if ever. My little pile of stones stood there in the yard, looking prouder than ever. Neighbors walked by and smiled at it. Mrs. Carter even said, it's kind of cute now. My rock garden went from being a problem to being the neighborhood hero. Karen tried to get rid of it, but in the end, it won. She was the one who lost everything: her power, her clipboard, her big attitude. Justice was served, and it felt good. Wow, isn't it wild how things can flip upside down so fast? 1 minute, Karen was strutting around like she was the queen of our street. She had her clipboard, her loud voice, and her big rules. She thought she was in charge of everything, telling me my rock garden was bad, calling the cops, acting like nobody could stop her. She was pointing fingers at me, saying I was the problem. But then bam, the next minute, she was the one in handcuffs. She got caught in her own trap, like a mouse in a cage she built herself. Crazy, right? It makes you think. Karen looked so strong, so bossy, like nothing could touch her. She walked around with her head high, telling everyone what to do. But all that time, she was hiding something big. She was stealing money, sneaking it away from the neighborhood, thinking nobody would find out. She pointed at me and my rocks to keep people looking the other way. But the truth came out like it always does. The cops knew. They were watching. And when they got her, it showed something important. Sometimes the loudest people, the ones who act perfect, have the most to hide. And then there's me. I didn't yell back at Karen. I didn't fight or make a big fuss. I just stayed quiet, stacking my rocks, watching her rant. I didn't know the cops were coming for her. I didn't know she was a thief. But by staying calm, by not letting her get to me, I came out on top. My little rock garden stayed, and Karen? She's gone. It's funny how that works. The ones who stay quiet, who don't try to boss everyone around, sometimes end up winning in the end. It's like a lesson you can carry with you. Maybe you've seen it, too. Have you ever known someone who acted big and tough, but then they got caught doing something wrong? Like a kid at school who brags all the time, but then the teacher finds out they didn't do their homework? Or a bully who picks on people, but one day they trip and fall in front of everyone? It happens. People who point fingers, who try to make others feel small, might be hiding their own mess. And when the truth comes out, they don't look so big anymore. But the quiet ones, the ones who don't make a lot of noise, they can surprise you. Like my rocks. They didn't talk back. They didn't fight Karen. They just sat there, being themselves. And in the end, they stayed while she left. It makes me smile to think about it. You don't always have to be loud or pushy to win. Sometimes, just being you, doing your thing, keeping your cool is enough. The neighborhood liked my rocks better than Karen's rules. That says a lot, doesn't it? So, what do you think? Have you ever seen someone get what's coming to them like Karen did? Maybe a bossy neighbor, a mean kid, or someone who thought they were better than everyone else. Did they fall into their own trap, too? I'd love to hear your stories. Drop them in the comments below. It's fun to share these moments, because they remind us that life has a way of working things out. The bad guys don't always win, and the little guys like me and my rock garden can come out shining. This whole thing makes me feel good. It's like a big, happy ending to a wild day. Karen thought she could stomp all over me, but she couldn't. The truth won. My rocks won. And now, every time I look at that little pile in my yard, I feel proud. It's a reminder that you don't have to be loud or mean to matter. You can just be yourself, and sometimes that's more than enough. Stick around, okay? I've got more stories like this, tales where the underdog, the quiet one, comes out on top. Life is full of surprises, and I love sharing them with you. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and let's keep the fun going. Tell me what you think below. Did Karen deserve what she got? What would you do with a neighbor like her? I can't wait to read what you say. Let's keep cheering for the little guys together.